Hello, everyone. A very, very warm welcome to Nabanna Earth Weekend or New Festival 2021. 100 years ago, Rabindranath Tagore founded Vishwabharati University and Kala Bhavan. This year, in our third edition of this festival, which is essentially a Shantiniketan focused festival, we are looking at the vision of Tagore, celebrating the vision of Tagore in its many, many forms, the many forms in which it manifested itself. Today's session is titled Tagore and the Natural World, the world of nature surrounding Tagore, the world of nature in which he chose to set Shantiniketan and his dreams of a cultural and arts and intellectual hub. We have a wonderfully interesting panel with us today, and today's session is co-sponsored, co-presented with our very, very old friends and favorite partners, the Goethe Institute, Mueller Bhavan, Kolkata. Before we start, after the introductions are over, I'm going to invite Ms. Astrid Wege, who is currently head of Mueller Bhavan Goethe Institute, to say a few words before we launch into the session. Meanwhile, let me introduce you to the panelists who are going to speak with us today and share their ideas and thoughts. Now, a little bit more about the various people on this panel. Achin Chakraborty is a professor of economics. Currently, he is the director of the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. He has research interests in economics, development economics, health economics, and the political economy of India. A PhD in economics from the University of California at Riverside, USA. He has published widely in national and international journals, and recently he has co-edited two books, The Land Question in India, State Dispossession and Capitalist Transition, and Changing Contexts and Shifting Roles of the Indian State. And he has also jointly authored Limits of Bargaining, Capital, Labor, and the State in Contemporary India. His op-ed pieces on socio-economic issues appear in leading dailies. Professor Achin Chakraborty is with us today, courtesy of the Goethe Institute, Mueller Bhavan. Thank you so much, Professor Chakraborty, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Professor Dikshit Sinha, thank you. Professor Dikshit Sinha retired as professor at the Department of Social Work, Vishwabharati University. He is the author of Rabindranath and Food, Punar Cotton Prize. You'll have to forgive my pronunciation, Prayas, for which he received the Majafar Ahmed Prize, and a poet's experiment in rebuilding Samaj and nation on Tagore and rural reconstruction, apart from several essays and articles on village studies, the Panchayat, problems of primary education, and rural reconstruction and its implementation. Pritha Sen, our third speaker today, has been described variously as a food ethnographer, food anthropologist, and food historian. She has over 2 decades of experience in journalism and strategic knowledge aggregation in the development space for national and international donor agencies and nonprofits. Her work in sustainable livelihoods with below poverty line populations in remote rural areas led her to research and document what she terms indigenous heritage cuisine. She is regarded as a leading authority on regional cuisines and the food culture of Eastern India. As consultant, she has curated the menus for the award-winning mustard restaurants in Mumbai and Goa. She lives in Gurgaon and divides her time between Nagaland, where she helps with creating sustainable livelihoods for over 200 women weavers, and her mission to revive the regional and micro-regional cuisines of Eastern India. So we look forward to very interesting inputs about what Tagore thought about regional and local cuisines. Holding the discussion together, our moderator for the afternoon is Bipasha Raha. Bipasha Raha is with the Department of History at Vishwabharati University, Shantiniketan. She herself has done considerable research in the area of rural reconstruction, and she has written on Tagore and the village, his ideas on the village. And we are very, very lucky that Bipasha has taken the time to be moderator today. And I'm now going to welcome Astrid Wege and invite her to say a few words about today's program before we continue. Astrid?
Thank you so much, Anjum. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a great pleasure and honor to welcome you from side of the Goethe Institut Max Mueller Bhavan to the Nabanna Earth Weekend 2021, the first issue which is completely online. Goethe Institut Max Mueller Bhavan is very happy to be partner of the Nabanna Earth Weekend. The festival is a wonderful platform to exchange ideas on literature and arts, as well as topical issues like sustainability and environmental challenges. The list of the contributors 2021, distinguished writers and artists, cultural and creative thinkers is really impressive. So congratulations on this wonderful program you set up. Goethe Institut Max Mueller Bhavan is honored and thrilled to support the participation of Professor Achin Chakraborty, who will speak on Tagore's ideas of sustainable development and so bridge Tagore's ideas and their relevance to today's very important topical issues. I'm sure that we will get many enlightening insights from his contribution as well as from the contributions of the other panelists. And I would like to thank Professor Chakraborty and all the other participants for joining us today. Great thanks goes to the festival organizers, namely Anjum Katyal, who invited us. So we are very honored and pleased for this collaboration. And of course, I would like to thank all of you who join from the viewers for your interest, for joining the festival. As I said, I wish you a very interesting festival and many interesting new ideas and inputs and insights. I'm sure you all will get them. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We just heard Astrid welcoming us and as the co-sponsor of today's session. And I'd now like to hand over to the able moderator, Bipasha Raha, who will now take this session forward. Bipasha, please go ahead.
Thank you, Anju. I'm very happy to be here. This is a beautiful session titled Beautifully Tagore and the Natural World. Now, Rabindranath's love for nature, this is very well known. He had a very profound love of nature. The skies, the spaciousness, the tranquility of the countryside, everything for him symbolized freedom. And his paintings, his literary creations, they give us an insight into the way he perceived nature. Now, while he was a nature poet, a poet whose work depicted his love for nature, at the same time, he was also somebody who in all aspects of his work related to rural reconstruction, which took a primary importance in his whole theme of thinking, there is I always found that there is a kind of belief that even nature, while there has to be a lot of respect for nature on the part of human beings, nature in its pristine beauty was evident to him, but he also wanted that nature should help in the development of human beings. And so he was always talking about a harmony between nature and the natural world and the human world. And that comes across in all his work. Even when he was talking about rural reconstruction, when he was talking about economic revival, when he was talking about human resource development at a time when nobody really thought about it. Today we talk so much about human resource development, but he didn't call it human resource development, but what he envisaged was nothing short of human resource development. So their nature played a very important role. There could be no getting away from nature. There has to be a lot of respect for nature. So with these few words, I would like to start today's proceedings. We have three speakers and they're going to talk about three different aspects of Tagore's thinking and work, his thought and his activities. May I now first request Professor Achin Chakraborty, who will be talking about Tagore's ideas of sustainable development, to share his thoughts on the subject. Professor Chakraborty.
Thank you, Professor Raha. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this Nabanna Art Festival. In particular, Anjum Katial and Vegya Street, and also Partha Chattopadhyay, who initially kept in touch with me. I take it as a wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts on Rabindranath Tagore's ideas of sustainable development. Of course, sustainable development is a kind of contemporary idea. It's only 3 or 4 decades old, but one can, in fact, draw on Rabindranath's writings and try to connect those writings with what we know today as sustainable development. So this is basically the motivation of my presentation here. Rabindranath Tagore delivered a lecture at the University of Calcutta in 1922, about a century ago. It was not meant to be a full-length lecture as such, rather an introduction to the theme of the lecture delivered by Leonard Elmhirst. And as many of us know, Elmhirst was a distinguished agricultural scientist, was visiting Shantiniketan around that time, and he would later be instrumental in taking forward Rabindranath's idea of rural reconstruction, on which Professor Dikshit Sinha will speak today. I'm not going into the aspects of rural reconstruction, which we can find from Rabindranath's writings and also his work on rural reconstruction. Instead of that, I spent some time on the idea of sustainable development as we understand it today, and what Rabindranath had to say, something similar. Elmhirst's lecture was titled The Robbery of the Soil, which actually raised the issues of unscientific and indifferent practices of squeezing the maximum out of the soil, thereby degrading it irreversibly. So since Elmhirst was an agricultural scientist, so he could see the problems with this degradation of soil. What is remarkable is that on that day of lecture, both Elmhirst and Rabindranath, they went beyond the proximate reasons. The proximate reasons might be the constraints, which actually came in the way of replenishment of the soil. And they actually identified lopsided development of cities at the expense of villages as the deeper reason for this degradation. You see that, starting from degradation of soil, both Rabindranath and Elmhirst, they moved on to the problem of this, what we call uneven development today. It's a lopsided development of cities at the expense of villages. And this particular theme actually reappeared in Rabindranath's writings around that time in several other places. For instance, he also wrote an essay titled City and Village, which was published in 1928. Rabindranath, in fact, could see that unless we address the overall development strategies and development issues, taking into account both cities and the countryside, and taking into account a kind of holistic idea about development, we really cannot talk about just the problems of the villages. I mean, of course, he here and there, in fact, he wrote about the problems of villages, problems of the cultivators, and particularly in his Chinnapatra, one in a couple of letters that he wrote to his niece Indira. And one or two letters actually are full of this description of how the villagers actually live. And so from these ideas, one can see that it is not just the love of nature as such. It's not that just the pristine nature and it's a love of nature as such. He was genuinely interested in development in a kind of holistic sense. Let me quote from City and Village. In the modern age, the machine has not only multiplied working capacity, but likewise the scale of profit, and herewith the greed of gain. That is how disharmony has been brought about between self-interest and community interest, and wars are spreading like wildfire. It is this greed that has cut at the root of interrelation of town and village, and the town has become a drain on the village because it has ceased to make its return. In other words, as the title of my presentation suggests, my focus would be on development or sustainable development more specifically, rather than environmental concerns as such. A version of that particular lecture was later published in a Modern Review in 1930. Curiously, the title was not The Robbery of the Soil. The title was actually Wealth and Welfare. And you see that how actually he transcends his immediate concerns of the production system in rural areas to wealth and welfare. And in that article, in fact, I can see that all the major development issues are discussed in that particular article, Wealth and Welfare in 1930. I quote from that article. It's a small article. It's a very short article. The standard of living in modern times has been raised far higher than the average level of our necessity, where the temptation of high living, normally confined to the negligible small section of the community, becomes widespread. Its ever-growing burden is sure to prove fatal to civilization. What it seems to suggest here was not completely unheard of around that time, because we know from the history of economic ideas, we know that in the early 20th century, we come across several thinkers and polemicists of that time who expressed similar sentiments about this overconsumption, over-exploitation of natural resources and things like that. In fact, in particular, it's widely known that Veblen's work, which was actually published in 1899, Veblen's Theory of the Leisure Class, where he actually spoke about the consumptive habits of the world's elite, which had been a matter of concern. And actually, Veblen's book is full of that. So this overconsumption and overexploitation of natural resources around that time, there are people who also raise this issue, but Rabindranath's way of looking at that was slightly different. And why different? I am coming to that part. In the same lecture, actually, he made a particular point very clear. I mean, it's very surprisingly, he talks about the institution. Now, what today we know as institution. What is the idea of institution that he's talking about? He's actually talking about the institution of private property in that article. And he used the metaphor of topography to argue that a certain degree of inequality based on private property is tolerable, so long as the country is not divided by the constant interruption of steep mountains, as if, steep mountains are just, unseemly wealth of the rich. Those are the steep mountains on a flat kind of space. And he's talking about that, it's using that topography metaphor. So in other words, he was concerned about this inequality that actually, divides people. So divided by constant interruptions of steep mountains. Like mountains, large fortunes and the enjoyment of luxury are also high walls of segregation. They produce worse divisions in society than any physical barriers. It now looks, gradually, it looks clear that he was not just concerned about nature as such. He's actually concerned about the unequal distribution of natural resources among the stakeholders. In the modern parlance, we call them stakeholders. And he could see clearly the high inequality actually could do more damage to the cause of sustainable development, which is the kind of wisdom that in the recent period we talk about. I mean, most of the scholars actually talk about sustainable development is not just about the environment. It is not just about the trade-off between present generation and future generations' interest. It is not like that, because unless you solve the issue of equity or inequality in the present generation, it would be increasingly difficult to solve the issue of present versus future generations' interest. So, which is at the core of sustainable development. So, in other words, as soon as you move out of that, his love for nature, which is, of course, which gets expressed in the numerous poems and songs that he has given us. As soon as you move out of that and look at some of the essays, and you could see that, how Rabindranath's ideas about development and came close to what today we call sustainable development. Now, briefly, I make a kind of distinction between different streams of literature that we can see in the recent period. On the one hand, we have these ideas of sustainable development. On the other, the scholars in literature, in fact, they are also looking at nature nowadays. And but I mean, over the past 20 or 30 years, there's a new stream of literature has come up broadly, which is called eco-criticism. Now, eco-criticism is something like, it's basically exploring the relationship between literature and the physical environment, if I put it simply. But I'm not talking about eco-criticism as such, even though eco-criticism actually has a lot more to say on Rabindranath's idea about the relationship between creative literature and physical environment. But I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about instead here is focusing on sustainable development, at the core of which there is some notion of equity, and equity not only between present and future, but also equity within the present generation. This growing concern with sustainable development, as we all know, reflects a basic belief that the interests of future generations should receive the same kind of attention that those of the present generation. But we should not forget this point that just by giving more attention to the future generation, we cannot ignore the present generation and inequality in the present generation. Now, this actually, remarkably, this idea actually comes up in Amartya Sen's writings. So that's why I find it so interesting that some of the ideas that Rabindranath, in fact, put forward in his essays, very short essays, and they're in fact full of ideas. And those ideas actually, I could see the reflection of those ideas again, in Amartya Sen's writings when it tries to kind of bring together this idea of sustainable development and what he calls human development. Now, human development, as you know, that UNDP has been promoting this idea of human development for long. It's about 30 years actually. Every year we have this human development report. And according to some, that there is some kind of disconnect between human development literature and sustainable development literature. But there's one very good article by Amartya Sen, which actually, in which he brings together these two streams of literature, human development and sustainable development. So I end my talk with this idea that instead of sustainable development, if we further make a kind of synthesis between sustainable development on the one hand and human development literature, which we are familiar with over the in the past 30 years or so, then we get a kind of synthesis in which actually some of the Rabindranath's writings actually fit very well. And I've already given some of these examples there. And not only just essays, I'll end with this particular play, that Muktodhara. Now, Muktodhara, again, I mean, many of you probably have read Muktodhara. And what is Muktodhara? The play Muktodhara actually revolves around a machine, Jantro, a machine that has been built up over 25 years by the royal engineer Vibhuti. And so what is the purpose? So just to tie up the fountain so that the people in Shiptorai, in the other village, they don't get the water. Now, this is the basic idea. Even though the machine actually is put in vivid terms, like, it's a monstrous, it's ugly, it's brutal. So as if, he is against machine. It's not. He's not against machine as such, because from his other writings, we know that he's not against machine. What he is against here is that the use of machine to deprive other people. So in other words, here, this Vibhuti's marvel, that is the machine that actually wind up the fountain, the water, and he doesn't let the water go to Shiptorai, people of Shiptorai, and people of Shiptorai would starve of water. And so that's the purpose here. So here the purpose is not towards common humanity, but it is rather a divisive kind of purpose. So when the machine actually is used for a divisive purpose here, just to deprive the people of Shiptorai, and that's why his criticism. So some commentators actually read Muktodhara from the point of view of this anti-dam kind of position, okay, anti-dam movements. So it's okay, one can read it as anti-dam, but okay, there is no harm in actually pushing it further to say that it is not an anti-dam position. Of course, I mean, it was remarkable. I mean, Muktodhara actually, it was in 1920s he wrote, and around that time, the probably the first dam in Maharashtra, actually, it was being talked about, it was being built. And he was very much sort of touched by or concerned by that kind of development. So probably that influenced him. But it is not just anti-dam position. What I'm trying to say is that in general, wherever the machine actually comes in the way of distribution of the fruits of development between groups of people unequally, I think he has written about that. So here, I think his focus is much more on this deprivation of Shivtarai, people of Shivtarai, rather than the dam as such. So, okay, I mean, one can contest this kind of reading, this kind of position, but I think that, not many people actually have looked at some of these writings, including Muktadhara, in this way, that, from sustainable development point of view, it is not development versus environment as such. Rabindranath never believed in development versus environment, or never development versus pristine nature. So just to protect pristine nature, you have to sacrifice development. That kind of position I don't find in Rabindranath Tagore's writings. Instead of that, he is against the kind of development, it's a kind of perverse development which he is actually critiquing. He is not critiquing the city life as such. He is critiquing actually the overexploitation of the countryside by the city people, and basically the unequal distribution of the fruits of the soil. And that is exactly the central point of some of these essays and the play Muktadhara. That's my reading of Rabindranath Tagore as far as the idea of sustainable development is concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. I just have a small observation on your paper. I totally agree with what you said, that he never wanted the nature to be saved. It was never nature versus development. But yes, development had to be in harmony with nature. That is something that comes across. Secondly, when he was talking about this kind of development, this is actually, he was, this much of what he was writing was a response to what has already been started from the time of Ram Mohan, when they were talking about the development of villages. And when he went to Shilai Dahu in 1890, from then onwards, he realized how the villages had been exploited at the expenses of the towns. It has been always a one-way flow. And he was talking about villages which had been the nucleus of Indian civilization, but they had been devastated. Everything, as he said, Lokhi, that is the goddess of wealth and prosperity, had left the villages. And this was evident from the derelict condition of the, the water bodies, of the wells, everything. It was evident over there. So it is true that he was actually talking about there should be a equality, a kind of equality in the development of both the villages and the towns, not just the towns at the expense of villages. And your take on the sustainable development part of it, this was very well articulated. Thank you. May I now request Professor Dikshit Sinha to please start your talk.
Let me begin by saying that Tagore's rural reconstruction work and rural reconstruction idea is large as anything he has produced. His ideas of rural reconstruction started at the very beginning of his life, when he began to consider two aspects of Indian civilizations, and at the same time tried to construct how the nation should be constructed, and also how the behind that nation building attempt, his ideas of India as a particular country and its identity played a big role. So I would cover these two aspects. And first of all, let me point out that his attempt to reconstruct the identity of India began at the very early stages of his life, at the very young age, when he wrote various pieces on the history of India, and tried to identify the core elements of Indian civilization. And secondly, on the basis of this particular kind of an idea of Indian civilization, he delves into the question how India as a particular kind of a society is being considered by the nationalists, and why it was faulty kind of a construction in contrast to the nationalist concept of India. He constructed what he called Swadeshi Samaj, and that he began to write about from the very early moment of his life, when we find he wrote various pieces on the Indian history, and particularly his first attempt to rebut the British historians' construction of Indian nationalists, such as Rani of Jhansi. And after that, there was various pieces on the history of India. I will not go into it, but I will refer to one particular article of his, or rather a review of Indian history, called Image of History of India, or Oitihashik Chitra, where he pointed out that the Indian civilization has a particular kind of an integration, what Professor Shobosachi Bhattacharya termed as a synthetic civilization. But behind that syncretic civilization, he pointed out that there was a past also, in the sense that there was a collective effort to construct the Indian society and India's past history. He pointed out that if we look at the Indian various kinds of nationalities, you will find that there was disparate kind of communities having no particular kind of linkages between themselves, giving one the impression that these are merely disparate communities. But he pointed out that not all communities had that particular kind of a character of disparate communities. He mentioned the three cases of Sikhs, three communities such as the Sikhs, the Maharashtrian, and the Rajputs, who in the past constituted themselves as a political community, in contrast to the communities that were merely religious communities, and therefore their base relied on religious perception of their past and their religious ideas. And he pointed out that the three communities that I just mentioned, the Sikhs, the Rajputs, and the Maharashtrians, had a historical consciousness. But in contrast to that, the other communities lacked any kind of historical consciousness. And therefore, the task he gave himself was to construct the national consciousness, and in the process build up the national identity, what he calls Swadeshi Samaj, as I've already mentioned. Now, he pointed out that once this political community, the religious community, constitute themselves as a political community, they will form what he called a Jano Samaj, or a people's community, and will acquire a certain kind of a consciousness. Now, from there, he wrote various kinds of articles arguing for the way forward for the other communities to integrate themselves in a particular kind of a national mold. We are all aware of his very famous article, What is Nation, or Nation Key? But before that, he wrote several articles where he posited the Indian conditions, and particularly the Indian subjugated condition, against the British dominance. And we are all aware of Edward Said's construction of Orientalism. And we all know that Orientalism is a kind of a construction which is now called as a post-colonial. But even before the post-colonial construction of Orient, he was, I think, the first man to point out that in contrast to the Occident or the Western civilization, the Indian civilization had a certain kinds of qualities, but it didn't have any kind of a nation. That particular point he elaborated later on in various articles, but the important point that he pointed out was the task was to build a national consciousness and rebuild the society from its very core. In his article called Bharatbarshiya Samaj or Indian Society, he pointed out that it is necessary to build what is called a national consciousness, lokochitta. How one could build that lokochitta was gone into in various other articles, and in doing so, he constantly harped on the theme against the nationalist positions or nationalist ideologues' construction of India as a nation, that it is necessary to understand that in contrast to the Western civilization, India has a certain kind of element, and that element has to be revived because that element has now become dissipated. India has become a disjointed and various kinds of malaise has set in the Indian society. What is that particular kind of an idea of rebuilding that national consciousness? He pointed out, as I was trying to mention you, that his concept of India versus the Western civilization was gone into in an article called The Purbo and Pushchim, where he quoted extensively from the French philosopher Guizot, wherein he pointed out that the hallmark of the Western civilization and Western society was their a selfish kind of an idea of a rebuilding or what we now call nationalism. And that particular kind of a theme, they posited against the Indian conditions, and the way they constructed the Orient had a particular kind of flavor, and it denigrated the Indian. And this denigration, against that denigration, he asked the question, is it possible to pose oneself and construct one's country in the mold of the nation that the Orient or rather the Occident was trying to, has built up and also was trying to place before the world? His answer was no. Because India's core ideas was what he called the collective welfare or Mongol. And on the basis of that collective welfare, one has to build up one's country. How could you do it? In through various articles, he pointed out that what is important to build up was to not toe the line of the Western civilization or the Western nations or follow the Englishmen, but rebuild the country, reinvent your identity, extensively build various kinds of schools, colleges, so that education could be spread among the country's populations, so that the country can know where they stand and people could rebuild their own particular kind of an identity. So these were his particular kind of an idea that he tried to proceed in contrast to the Occident's construction of their own nationalities, and said that what is important was our particular kind of an idea of Mongol or collective welfare. This collective welfare, if once built, then he thought that the Jano Samaj or people's community could be built. In the 1902, he very pointedly said that it is now the time to build ourselves, and it is now the time to build our own nation or Jati Nirmane Samaj. Now, through various other kinds of articles, he continued to argue about how to go about the path of nation building. In Swadeshi Samaj and in articles after articles, he pointed out that this is the time to rebuild not only our own country, but at every moment of time, various aspects of a nation, such as our language, our villages, our various other aspects has to be built up. Now, specifically, this was gone into in great deal of detail in his Swadeshi Samaj. But this is a very famous article, no doubt about it. But one or two important points in this article has to be mentioned. That in that Swadeshi Samaj, he pointed out that it is important to build this concept of communities, and that particular community can be built through various measures, and that measures has to be followed very religiously so that we can build our own country. Addressing his countrymen, he pointed out that the immediate tasks lie before them is to bring about order in place of disorder, to breathe life in the inert body, to usher in liberal humanism in place of narrowness. These are the immediate creative tasks that becomes you. Let me go directly to another article that, or rather, his address to the delegates of Pabna Congress, where he once again placed before the delegates the blueprint of rebuilding the country. And how to reconstruct the country was gone into in detail, and particularly the villages. But he also pointed out that it is necessary also to cement the ties between the various communities, and also the division that we have, community division that we have among us and among the Muslims. In this particular article, he also asked the delegates to take up one village and make it self-sufficient. In Bengali, he used the term Proyojon Sadhan Kham. There also he first tabled his particular kind of idea of cooperatives and pointed out that this is very important. Later on, this was elaborated in his various articles from 1924. And not only this, but another important aspect was that he pointed out it is through these measures one can build up the country. But at the same time, he pointed out, if you don't have the periphery properly built and given it a shape, then how can you travel to the core of the country? So therefore, you have to, first of all, build the periphery of the country. And through that means only you can create the country. So this was his scheme. And this was I should say, important aspect of his project of rural reconstruction, because this was the time when, after delivering his address, he met some of the leaders and he asked these people, rather the delegates and the leaders, to follow the path of rural reconstruction. He, in his 1939 address to the delegates at the time of opening of Shilpo Sadan's showroom in Calcutta, he said that I placed before the nationalists my idea of rural reconstruction, but I found that they clearly ignored my request. So I had to take up this issue. So this was the background situation that led him to launch his rural reconstruction mission. But at the same time, let me point out that it was not that this was the beginning of his 1908 was the beginning of his rural reconstruction measures. We all know that he took up the management of his Jamindari estates in Bangladesh from 1890s or 1891. And after that, he started intervening in various aspects of village life so that the villages can have a better kind of a life. But it is also necessary to point out from 1907 and 8, he took up the rural reconstruction measures in his Jamindari estates of Shilaidaho, where he divided his estates into 5 areas or parganas and constituted various kinds of communities. We all know this aspect. And after that, when Sriniketan was established in 1922, he extended his rural reconstruction measures. So this was the background of his rural reconstruction measures. And we find that Sriniketan was not a mirror image of his work in Jamindari estate. In many ways, it was more broader and various important aspects such as building of health societies, cooperatives, and reviving handicaps, and better kind of an agricultural endeavor. So all these aspects were started in Sriniketan.
Thank you, Dikshita. It's been a wonderful lecture. You have put very eloquently you trace the ideological background to the rural reconstruction work of Tagore. You actually tried to contextualize him in the light of the civilizational discourse that became so important in 19th century. There was a response from the Indian side to the Western construct of the Indian nation and to the Indian civilization. So that was very good. That was put very well. And you also tried to show how Tagore's rural reconstruction work was also a response to the needs of the time, because there was a lot of people who were talking about rural development at that time, but not in a comprehensive manner that Tagore did, but in bits and pieces there was work going on. And then there was also an agricultural expert, Bolkar, who had come in the 1890s, and he had been talking about the need for rural development. So in Swadeshi Samaj and Pabna Pradeshik Sammelin, that actually contained the blueprint of his ideas on rural reconstruction. He never really moved away from this. What happened in Sriniketan, there was a greater application of these ideas which had evolved over time. Thank you, Dikshita. It was a wonderful lecture and it was wonderful to hear you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just like to ask Pritha to please come in, and Pritha is going to talk about Rabindranath and food. So it's going to be very interesting. Pritha, I hand over the mic to you.
Thank you, Bipasha, and I thank the organizers of Nabanna, the Earth Festival, for inviting me here. And it is really an honor to be able to talk about Rabindranath and his relationship with food. This must be a very, very high point in my life today, and I thank you all very much. Rabindranath had once told Obun Thakur that everybody has torn me to bits. In trying to analyze me, they lost the very essence of my being. I now see what he had meant when I see what is happening all around us in these days of food insecurity. There is this huge explosion of eating, and it has been what I call mindless eating. And there have been attempts to also rope in Rabindranath Tagore in this entire gastronomic display that we have nowadays. Things like Rabindranath's favorite foods, what Rabindranath really loved. Now, do we really know what Rabindranath really loved? Was it really possible to gauge the mind of a person whose thoughts were boundless. You know, a genius whose creativity knew no bounds. Is it really possible? But perhaps if we look into his writings, if we look into his expressions, his relationship with food is completely in sync with what Achin Chakraborty just spoke about. Everything was in sync with nature. Even the food that we have come across in his writings is all in complete sync with nature. If I begin with Chhaut-Pat, you know, in Rabindranath's other writings for adults, we don't much find a mention of food. He's traveled so much. We would think that he would describe all the banquets or all the food or all the new discoveries that he'd made. But we hardly find anything like that there. It is, you know, he has paid, it seems to us, little attention to food, actually. I will come to that later, what food in his mind meant. But there is also this misconception that he was a gourmet and he loved his food. And there are various stories about it. But these myths, I think, need to be broken. If we begin with his Chhaut-Pat, what do we find in Chhaut-Pat? Just for, as an example, in his description of the letters of the alphabet to primary school children, what does he say? Hoshoi dirghoi boshe khaye khir khoi, bati hate e oi, hag daye doi doi, dak pare o, bhatano borobo, ta tha da dha, bole am pari chalo jai, pa pha ba bha, jai mathe saradin dhan kate. Then in Chhaut-Pat Ditiyo Bhag, where it's slightly more evolved for children who've grown up a little, we have mention of dheki pete dhan bhane buri, khola pete bhaje khoi muri. And then he goes on to describe shorisha, kolayed dal, all being taken to the haat, the weekly market. Then there is this other one, which is a big favorite of mine, the one that is Anjana Nodi Tire. In that poem, the name of the Pishi there escapes my mind, but there is this blind musician, and Pishi is so enamored and enraptured by his music that she gives him a kombol. And along with that, what does she give him? Chire murkite tini bhore den. I'm forgetting the exact lines, but it is chire and murki. And then she makes him sit down and have miche piche puli. Now, all these little mention of food here gives us an insight into what it was that really gave him actual comfort. It is going back to his childhood, where apparently the first poem that he wrote when he was 8 years old, you know, the famous one about where he's having his doi and his chire and his kola, kodori. His kola, his bananas, he's mixing it up nicely in a bowl and he's really enjoying it. And he wipes the bowl clean, and so that even the ants go back home hungry. You know, if you connect the dots here, from the time that he wrote that poem, and then he went on all his travels, and that's where popular imagination put him into this role of a gourmet. He went on all his travels. He used to come back, story goes that he used to go for banquets in his jobba, and what he didn't like to eat, he would put it into a satchel hidden under his jobba. And he would come back with all the menu cards and give it to the women in the kitchen. Now, here too, we have to understand that unlike Dwarkanath Thakur, Rabindranath Thakur was a very austere man. He was known as Maharshi, and he led the life of an ascetic. So his food also was extremely simple, and apparently it could not, each meal could not be more than 4 annas. Whereas Dwarkanath Thakur's meals used to be, each meal was possibly about rupees 300 or more. So Rabindranath Thakur's meals could not go beyond 4 annas. And it is in this kind of an environment that Rabindranath grew up. So he also grew up on very simple, austere meals. It was a Vaishnav household, and the kitchens mainly cooked vegetarian meals, and that is how he grew up. And when he went out into the world, he saw all these new things. A creative mind will obviously want to explore more. So he would bring back the menus and he would give it to the Tagore kitchens, which by time were becoming famous as being very experimental, thanks to Gyanodhanandini Devi and later, of course, Prabhasundari Devi, who put together one of the biggest tomes on Bengali cuisine that we have today, and would tell them, now see how you can do it or how you can make it. And he would enjoy that, like his Khamkhayali Shobha. He had told Mrinalini Devi that nothing that is served at the Khamkhayali Shobha should be ordinary. Everything has to be extraordinary, something very different. He was always pushing the boundaries. He was pushing the limits of his food to see where his heart lay or where he was getting real succor. So the Khamkhayali Shobha came up with all these, Mrinalini Devi also came up with all these very, very curious dishes, like a jackfruit fish curry with no fish in it, or a Jamaican jalebi. Then for one of his birthdays, cauliflower sandesh was made. So the Tagore household was into experimenting and creating and exploration of food. And while Rabindranath did not stop that, he encouraged it. It was only because he wanted to see what lay beyond this. And each time he would come back to his own soil, he never romanticized food. For him, food was something for sustenance. And if it was for sustenance, then it had to be sustainable. And that is why we find that he ate very little. And, I've read a lot of Rani Chando's writings because she was very close to the poet and has described some of his meals. And that made me think that he was constantly looking for what could he was not addressing the elite or the haves, as Dr. Chakraborty also said, that it was this lopsided development that always bothered him. He was looking for what could be sustainable and shared by all. So in his meals also, he was looking at, to crack the puzzle. So at one time, writes Rani Chando that he would only have Hobishano, saying that that was the best thing for him. And in this climate, the best thing for everybody, boiled rice and vegetables. Then at one time, he experimented with just raw vegetables. Even potatoes and gourds, he was having raw with a twist of lime. Then at one point in time, he had only neem juice. These are all very famous stories. He had only neem juice for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And parathas fried in castor oil. Or just garlic. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, he was having garlic fried into varas. So these were all his experiments to figure out what could be the best possible solution for a nation that was hungry. We have to understand the period that he was writing in, the period that he lived in. And if we are talking about exactly 100 years ago, he had lived through the Spanish flu, a pandemic of the likes of what we are facing today. He had lived through the entire complete breakdown of the Bengal economy. He had seen the hunger of the peasants. He had seen the greed of our conquerors and the hunger of our peasants. And therefore, his entire mind was occupied with what could be a sustainable form of sustenance. And therefore, when you talked about Bipasha human resource development, when he was creating literature for children, because those are the minds that could be formed for children. You notice his Sahaj Path or his children's stories are all replete with beautiful descriptions of the community. What he was looking for was a sustainable community and the foods that sustained it. So his relationship with food, if you ask me, was one of exploration. He was not a gourmet. He was not really interested in food as such for the sake of food. It was for sustenance of mind, body, and soul. And so there are these various, say for instance, I'll give you another example. In, I think it is Jogajog. In Jogajog, the protagonist is a very wealthy person. He's Nouveau-riche, and he shows off his silver dinner set, and he's arrogant and he has attitude. But when he sits down to eat, he cannot do without his mota chaler bhat, his parboiled rice, and his ghat, his panchmishali, the mishmash of different vegetables that we make, which we call ghat, and his kolai dal. He could not do without that. You know, we get an insight into the kind of food that gave comfort actually to Rabindranath. Yes, it's true that he had Western food for dinner, chicken roast or a soup or a pie, and that today has suddenly become his favorite foods. No, he had those because he's figured out soon enough that these were the simple foods that sustained him at night. He did not want to have anything heavy. He figured out what kept him healthy. And possibly that is why, this is my reading, possibly that is why he had that kind of food at night. He always ate with a fork and spoon, because somebody who, his nationalism and his internationalism came together here, where even when it was Indian food, even when it was Bangla food, he ate with a fork and spoon. And to my mind, that was because he was a person who could just leave his food at any time. He needed his hands free, leave his food at any time and get up and go into a different space. Perhaps he did not like lingering smells on his fingers that he used to write. Huh? And so it was at his food, his eating style was also very interesting. While he, like I keep saying, he did not eat very much. He liked, aesthetics was very important to him. And the art of laying out the food was important to him. And when he sat down to eat, it was what we have always done in our traditions. We have first offered it to God, and then we eat, then we share. So when it was laid out like that, like a noiveddu, he would sit down and he would just hand over the food, the kind of, whoever liked, he knew who liked what. and it would all start disappearing. He would just send it to somebody's room or give it to somebody else. And by the time he actually ate, there were possibly a few little morsels left, and he was very happy with that. Ultimately, it was the food that was rooted to the soil that gave him the most comfort and which he thought was sustainable for the people of our country.
Pritha, dudhete amshatto feli tahate kodoli doli. So it was fantastic what you said. It's very true. You brought in many aspects, many dimensions to the discourse on food that became so important in the 19th century discourse, which carried on into the 20th century. When you were talking about offering food as noibeddo, you were actually talking about what Vivekananda had talked about in Paschatto. You know, food for mental well-being, for physical well-being, and food had to be rooted to the soil. So this is very important, a very important observation that you made. And then when you talked about our indigenous food, that also is very true, because in the 19th century, while you have one side talking about bhoj, the elaborate banquets that were held by the rich people in Calcutta, there was also the question of poverty, hunger. So there was also what was, as you said, sustainable food for sustenance, which had to be rooted to the soil. So many aspects you brought into your discussion. I also agree. And what you said about using forks and spoons, probably he could also write while eating. That again was one of the reasons probably why he was doing that. And all his writings, they bring out only his love for the indigenous food. And when he was talking about Sriniketan, his rural experiment, he was talking about fruits, all the kinds of fruit trees that could be grown over here. So thank you. You have really touched upon many points, many parts of this discussion that was going on in the 19th century, because that was also the time when the question of debility became very important. The Bengalis' lack of a martial culture, their weak health, the debilitated Bengali, that was focused upon. So how to contest that? So food and physical culture, that went hand in hand, and that was practiced. And when you talked about Prakash Sundari Devi, as I believe that much of it, it was a collection of all kinds of food items, because this so much of use of chicken broth, that I don't know how much of it was acceptable to the respectable Bengali households, because for a very long time, chicken was never really introduced into the kitchen. So that maybe in the outhouses or baire, that kind of, when you had guests, and that also guests from the Western society, only then. But other than that, it was our datas and our shags and everything that became
Thank you very much, Bipasha.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Rishiraj Bhaumik addressed to Dr. Chakraborty. He says, excellent session by Dr. Chakraborty. I have a question. Tagore's rural developments was more of a social action than just theories, which were later carried by his son, Rabindranath Tagore. My question to you, sir, is after Rabindranath, did the Tagore model fail? If so, what is the cause?
Well, I mean, whether that experiment on rural reconstruction failed or not, I mean, that itself can be discussed and debated, because Rabindranath was never so ambitious to spread out his ideas of rural reconstruction everywhere, because there is, I mean, in his writings it is there. I think he said that if I can work with just one single village and see the change, that itself is a contribution. That itself is something that one can do. So even if one can do something in a single village, we cannot say that it's a failure as such. But there are numerous other reasons. But my talk was mainly on the ideas rather than his actual intervention on ground. The level of idea, we learned a lot from him, particularly in the recent period, like, past couple of decades, we see the developments, sustainable development, various kinds of ecological movements, environmental movements. And in these the movements and the ideas which actually inform these movements, is there any place for Rabindranath's writings here? And my answer would be yes, definitely. And it is not, the usual kind of interpretation that, he loved nature and that's why, he loved environment and this and that. It's not. So my interpretation would be that he had very clear idea about what sustainable development should mean, and basically keeping the idea of equity and equality at the core of his discussion. So that was my point, actually. I tried to make that point. Thank you very much for asking this question.
Thank you. Anjum, I think we could go to the next question.
Shubham Datta is asking Pritha Sen. It's quite interesting to look at Tagore's gastronomical habits. He was from a family of zamindars. Was there any class centricity in Tagore's conceptualization of food? His literary works are mostly set in agrarian worlds. Greenery, fruitfulness all come as potent metaphors. Was there any class centricity? For example, a poem like Ora Kaj Kore.
Well, there definitely was a class centricity because he believed that, well, these are entirely my thoughts, that it was rural India that was the heart and soul of India. And unless we can build self-sufficient rural community, we cannot, of course, I mean, you need, like Dr. Chakraborty also said, that you need the city alongside as you go along with development. But the base has to be strong, and he believed that the base was rural India. The agrarian economy was the economy that we had to concentrate on. So there was definitely a class centricity in Rabindranath Tagore. One tiny example in answer to this thing, that if you will see that the leitmotif in Sahajpat, you look at Sahaj Pratham Bhag, you look at Sahajpat Dityo Bhag, is the Mudid Dukan. Every third poem ends with either the Mudid Dukan opening or the Mudid Dukan closing down and a tim tim kore ekta bati jolche Mudid Dukane. This entire thing of finally the entire sustenance of the people being held together in that Mudid Dukan.
Thank you. There is another question for you, Pritha, which is that this is from Shuli Ghosh. She wants to know, is there any place where you can actually experience the aesthetics and the cuisine of the Tagore household?
I would not know what you mean by the cuisine of the Tagore household, because as far as I know, that a large part of the dishes that have been documented are not really cooked in, or have not been passed down to the other Tagore generations, and they don't even know, many of them don't even know that they existed. So, which is why I keep going back to Tagore looking at sustainability, not something that is unsustainable. So, if you think about Tagore cuisine, perhaps it's more in the pages of books than in actual real life on their tables.
May I add to that, Pritha?
Yeah.
The thing is that much of it is memory. It is not there. I mean, it's all documented that these kind of dishes used to be cooked. But if you try to, if you attempt to cook some of the dishes described by even Pragya Sundari Devi, it is impossible. You won't even get the ingredients. I have grave doubts whether they were ever really done it. I mean, they had done it.
There is this entire thing about Tagore being mortally scared of chilies, that even if you put a single chili on for garnish, he would refuse to have that dish. Now, there are two very interesting sides to this. The one is that he did not like fusion food. He would tell his daughters-in-law or granddaughters-in-law that don't give me indigenous food with a foreign smell. আমাকে বিদেশি গন্ধওয়ালা দেশি খাবার দিও না। That was one. And the second was that why he rejected the chili brought in by the Portuguese as per popular lore. He rejected the Europeans. He enjoyed having something that was there before the chili came in, something called choi or chui jhal, found in southern Bengal, a kind of a pepper plant whose twigs and base, the bark was used in cooking at one time, and which was pungent and which released a fiery flavor to curries. He enjoyed having that, and that used to be sent for him from erstwhile East Bengal to Shantiniketan. So there's a contradiction here, and I find that very interesting.
They called it jhal data in Sundarban region.
Yeah, so chui jhal, and it is jhal. I have used it. I've used it. It is jhal. So there is this contradiction again within, but then there is one man that you can never pin down. Thank you for giving me this time.
Thank you, Pritha.
I want to thank you, Achinda, for giving us so much of your time. Pritha, thank you so much.